In the depths of Blackmoore Hall's vault, beneath marble floors inlaid with gold, lies a ledger bound in human skin. Each entry, written in crimson ink, lists a name, a date, and a single word: paid. Tonight, you'll discover why Magnus Blackmoore's fortune cost 68 lives, and why the debt may never be settled. The autumn rain of 1888 hammered against the grimy windows of the Philadelphia Tribune as investigative journalist Phoebe Lark spread the mysterious documents across her desk. The gas lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows over what appeared to be financial records unlike any she'd encountered in her 15 years of exposing corporate corruption. 68 deaths, she whispered, her finger tracing the neat columns of the ledger, each one coinciding with a surge in Blackmoore Industries' stock prices. Phoebe had received the documents from an anonymous source 3 days prior, delivered by a trembling messenger boy who claimed they'd been stolen from Blackmoore Hall itself. The boy had vanished before she could question him further, leaving behind only a cryptic note. The blood price is coming due. The ledger detailed a pattern so systematic it chilled her to the bone. Every 3 months, without fail, a tragic accident would befall someone connected to the Blackmoore empire. A mine collapse here, a factory fire there, a mysterious drowning in the family's private lake. And within days of each tragedy, Magnus Blackmoore's wealth would multiply exponentially. She opened her notebook and began transcribing the most damning entries. March 15, 1871, mine explosion, 27 dead. Stock price, $12 to $41 per share. June 21, 1874, Eveline Blackmoore drowns. Railroad contract secured, $800,000 profit, September 8, 1878. Thomas Blackmoore dies of blood loss. Silver vein discovered beneath cemetery. The calculations were staggering. Magnus Blackmoore had transformed from a struggling coal miner in the Appalachian Mountains to one of America's wealthiest industrialists, amassing over $6 million by 1888. But the price, according to these documents, had been paid in human lives. Phoebe's hand trembled as she turned to the final page of the ledger. There, in Magnus's own handwriting, was what appeared to be a contract written in faded brown ink. The Pact of 4, blood for fortune, marrow for molten gold. 1 life each season, or the coffers shall run dry. Signed in the year of our Lord 1870, under the moonless sky, by Magnus Blackmoore and the 3 who remain nameless. The journalist's rational mind struggled to process what she was reading. Surely this was some elaborate fraud, a competitor's attempt to destroy the Blackmoore reputation, but the documentation was too detailed, too precise. Bank records, death certificates, stock transactions, all legitimate, all traceable. She needed to see Blackmoore Hall for herself. The next morning, Phoebe packed her camera and notebook, telling her editor she was investigating a story about industrial safety violations. The train journey to the Blackmoore estate in western Pennsylvania took 6 hours, winding through valleys where the autumn leaves had turned the color of dried blood. Blackmoore Hall rose from the mountainside like a Gothic monument to wealth and power. Its stone walls, darkened by decades of coal dust, stretched 4 stories into the gray sky. Gothic spires pierced the clouds, and gargoyles perched on every corner, their stone eyes seeming to follow Phoebe's carriage as it approached the main entrance. The butler who answered the door was an elderly man with skin like parchment and eyes that held no warmth. "Miss Lark, I presume? Master Blackmoore is expecting you." Phoebe's blood ran cold. She had made no appointment, sent no telegram. How could Magnus possibly know she was coming? The butler led her through corridors lined with oil paintings of long-dead Blackmoores. Each portrait seemed to watch her pass, their eyes glistening with an unnatural sheen. The marble floors were indeed inlaid with gold, creating intricate patterns that resembled ancient ritual circles. "Master Blackmoore will see you in the library," the butler announced, opening massive oak doors that groaned on their hinges. The library was a cathedral of knowledge, its shelves stretching 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of biblical judgment. But it was the man seated behind the mahogany desk who commanded Phoebe's attention. Magnus Blackmoore was not what she had expected. Instead of a robust industrial baron, she found a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and hands that shook with palsy. His hair had gone completely white, and his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible secrets. Miss Lark, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been expecting you for quite some time. Please, sit. We have much to discuss before the sun sets. As Phoebe settled into the leather chair across from his desk, she noticed the walls were lined with newspaper clippings, obituaries, accident reports, and financial news, all meticulously organized by date. In the center of the collection was a large photograph of a mining disaster, the caption reading, 27 perish in Blackmoore mine explosion. You've come about the Pact, Magnus said, his fingers drumming against the desk. I can see it in your eyes. You think me a monster, don't you? I think you're a man who's made some very questionable business decisions, Phoebe replied carefully, her hand moving to the notebook in her bag. Magnus laughed, a sound like autumn leaves scraping against stone. Questionable? My dear woman, I've built an empire that will last centuries. Every railroad track in 3 states carries my steel. Every factory from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia burns my coal. I've created jobs for thousands and wealth that will benefit generations. At what cost? Phoebe challenged. According to these documents, 68 people have died in connection with your business ventures. That's not coincidence, that's systematic murder. The old man's eyes flashed with something between anger and fear. You don't understand. I never wanted any of this. The Pact, it was never meant to go this far. He stood slowly, walking to a painting of himself from 20 years earlier, a portrait of a man in his prime, with clear eyes and steady hands. I was nothing, Miss Lark, a coal miner's son from the hills of Kentucky. I worked 16 hours a day in those cursed tunnels, breathing dust and death, watching good men die for pennies while the mine owners grew fat on their suffering. Magnus turned back to her, his face etched with decades of guilt. One night in 1870, I was working late in the deepest shaft when I heard voices, not human voices, something else. Something that knew my name, knew my dreams, knew my desperation. They offered me everything I'd ever wanted. Wealth, power, respect. All I had to do was sign their contract. And what exactly did you sign? Phoebe pressed, her journalistic instincts overriding her growing fear. A death warrant, Magnus whispered. Not just for others, but for my own soul. The Pact demanded blood, 1 life every 3 months, freely given or taken by circumstance. In return, my ventures would prosper beyond imagination. He moved to a portrait of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Eveline was the first to pay the price. My own wife drowned in our garden fountain on the day I signed the largest steel contract in Pennsylvania history. I found her floating face down in water that had turned black as coal. Phoebe's pen flew across her notebook, recording every word. And your son, Thomas, died on his 21st birthday, Magnus said, his voice breaking. Bled out in his sleep from no wound we could find. The next morning, surveyors discovered silver beneath his grave. Coincidence? I think not. The room seemed to grow colder as Magnus continued his confession. I've tried to break the Pact, Miss Lark. I've consulted priests, spiritualists, even traveled to Europe to seek answers from ancient texts, but the debt continues to accrue. Every 3 months, like clockwork, someone dies and my fortune grows. Then why are you telling me this? Phoebe asked. Why expose yourself? Magnus walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. Because I'm dying, Miss Lark. My body is failing, consumed by the very wealth I sought to create. But the Pact, it doesn't end with my death. It passes to the next generation, and the next, until the bloodline is extinct or the contract is fulfilled. He turned back to her, his eyes pleading. I have no heirs left. Thomas was my only child, and Eveline, she never had the chance to bear another. When I die, the Pact will seek a new host, someone connected to the Blackmoore legacy. Perhaps a distant relative, or maybe someone who has simply spent too much time investigating our family's secrets. The implication hit Phoebe like a physical blow. You're suggesting that by coming here, by learning about the Pact, I've somehow become entangled in it? I'm not suggesting anything, Magnus said quietly. I'm telling you that the shadows in this house have been whispering your name for 3 days. The same voices that came to me in that mine shaft 38 years ago. They're hungry, Miss Lark, and they always collect what they're owed. As if summoned by his words, a low moan echoed through the library. The gas lamps flickered and dimmed, casting the room into near darkness. In the shadows between the bookshelves, Phoebe thought she saw movement, shapes that didn't belong to any human form. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Help me break the pact," Magnus replied, "before it's too late, before it claims another innocent soul. The answer lies in the foundation of this house, in the room where the original contract was signed. But I'm too weak to go there alone, and the servants, they've all fled." The moaning grew louder, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Phoebe clutched her notebook tighter, her rational mind warring with the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "If I help you," she said, "if we somehow manage to break this contract, what happens to your wealth, to your empire?" Magnus smiled sadly. "It crumbles to dust as it should have long ago. But perhaps, Miss Lark, some prices are too high to pay. Perhaps some fortunes are too blood-soaked to deserve preservation." The library door creaked open, though no one stood in the doorway. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing several lamps and carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. In the distance, Phoebe could hear what sounded like footsteps, dozens of them, moving through the corridors of Blackmoore Hall. "They're coming," Magnus whispered. "The 68 who paid the price. They rise every time someone learns the truth about the Pact. We have until midnight to reach the Foundation room, or we'll join their ranks forever." Phoebe looked around the library, taking in the portraits of the dead, the newspaper clippings of tragedies, and the growing shadows that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. She had come here seeking a story, but she had found something far more dangerous, a curse that threatened to claim her as its next victim. "Where is this Foundation room?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Magnus moved to a bookshelf and pulled out a leather-bound volume. The shelf swung inward, revealing a stone staircase that descended into absolute darkness. 3 levels down, past the wine cellar and the coal furnace. The room where I signed away my soul and doomed my family to eternal suffering. As they prepared to descend into the depths of Blackmoore Hall, Phoebe couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover truths that would change everything she thought she knew about the world. The Pact might have made Magnus Blackmoore rich beyond imagination, but it had also created something far more terrifying, a legacy of death that refused to stay buried. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder, and with them came voices, whispers of the dead calling out for justice, for payment, for the blood debt that had been building for 18 years. Phoebe followed Magnus into the darkness, her camera and notebook her only weapons against the supernatural horror that awaited them below. The stone staircase spiraled downward into the earth like the throat of some ancient beast. Phoebe's fingers trembled as she gripped the iron railing, her other hand clutching the oil lamp Magnus had given her. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in every corner. "How deep does this go?" she asked, her voice echoing in the narrow space. "Deeper than any honest foundation should," Magnus replied, his breathing labored as they descended. "When I purchased this land, the surveyor mentioned there were natural caves beneath the property. I thought it would be perfect for wine storage. I had no idea what else lay dormant down here." They passed the first landing, where an iron gate stood slightly ajar. Through the bars, Phoebe could see rows of wine bottles covered in decades of dust, but it was the smell that made her stomach turn. Not the musty odor of aged wine, but something sharper, more metallic. "Blood," Magnus said, noticing her expression. "The first sacrifice was performed here. A vagrant I found on the property freezing in the winter of 1870. I told myself I was being merciful, ending his suffering, but the truth is, I was already changing. The Pact had already begun to corrupt my soul." They continued down to the second level, where the coal furnace dominated a large chamber. The massive iron structure sat cold and silent, but Phoebe could see dark stains on the stone floor around it, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Thomas died here," Magnus whispered. "On his 21st birthday. I found him at dawn lying before the furnace as if he'd been making some final offering, but there was no wound, no explanation for why every drop of blood had left his body." The air grew thicker as they descended to the third level, heavy with the weight of earth and something else, an oppressive presence that seemed to press against Phoebe's chest. The walls here were different, older, carved from living rock rather than built with mortar and stone. "These passages predate the house," Magnus explained, his voice barely audible. According to local Native American legends, this was once a sacred site, a place where the barrier between worlds was thin. I thought it was merely superstition, until I heard the voices for the first time. They emerged into a circular chamber carved from black stone. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. Not quite hieroglyphs, not quite runic script, but something that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark with centuries of use. "This is where it began," Magnus said, setting his lamp on the altar. "Where I signed the Pact of Four." Phoebe approached the altar carefully, her journalist's eye taking in every detail. The stone was covered in carved names, each one etched with what appeared to be a sharp blade. She counted 68 names in total, with 3 spaces remaining blank. "Who were the other 3 signatories?" she asked. "I never knew their true names," Magnus replied. "They appeared as shadows, speaking in voices that seemed to come from the stone itself. They called themselves the Keepers of the Ancient Debt, guardians of a contract that predates recorded history." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the chamber dropped precipitously. The oil lamps flickered and dimmed, and in the growing darkness, Phoebe could see 3 figures materializing near the altar. They weren't quite human. Their forms seemed to shift between solid flesh and swirling shadow. Magnus Blackmoore, the center figure, spoke, its voice like grinding stone. "You have brought an uninvited guest to our sacred place." "I brought her because the Pact is killing me," Magnus replied, his voice stronger now, defiant. "I've paid your price for 18 years. 68 lives have been sacrificed to feed your ancient hunger. When is enough enough?" The shadow figure laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Enough? There is no enough, mortal. The debt is eternal, passed from generation to generation until the bloodline is extinct. You signed willingly, sealed the contract with your own blood. There is no escape." "But there is no bloodline left," Magnus protested. "Thomas is dead. Eveline is dead. I have no heirs to carry the burden." "No heirs of blood," the second figure hissed, "but heirs of knowledge. Those who learn the truth become bound by it. Miss Lark has read the ledger, walked the halls of your cursed mansion, descended into our sacred chamber. She is marked now, claimed by the Pact." Phoebe felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "I never signed anything. I never agreed to any contract." "Ignorance is not innocence," the third figure intoned. "Knowledge is consent. By seeking the truth, you have become part of it. The Pact will continue through you and through your heirs until the ancient debt is paid in full." Magnus stepped forward, placing himself between Phoebe and the shadow figures. "She's innocent in this. Take my life if you must, but let her go free." "Your life is already forfeit," the center figure replied. "The cancer eating at your bones is our gift to you, payment for your years of faithful service. You will die before the next full moon, and the Pact will pass to her." "What debt?" Phoebe demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "What ancient wrong are you trying to right? What justifies the murder of 68 innocent people?" The shadow figures seemed to grow larger, their forms becoming more solid and more terrible. "Long ago, when the world was young and the barriers between realms were strong, your ancestors stole from us. They took our sacred relics, our sources of power, and used them to build their civilization. The debt is not just gold and silver, but the very essence of life itself." "That's impossible," Phoebe protested. "We're talking about events that would have happened thousands of years ago. No one alive today should be held responsible for the actions of their distant ancestors." "Time is an illusion," the second figure hissed. "The debt accumulates interest across the centuries. What began as a simple theft has grown into a cosmic injustice that threatens the balance of all existence. The Pact is not just about Magnus Blackmoore's wealth, it is about restoring what was taken." Magnus moved to the altar, his hands shaking as he traced the carved symbols. There has to be a way to break this. Some loophole, some escape clause. No contract is absolute. "The contract can be broken," the third figure said, its voice carrying a note of cruel amusement. "But the price is higher than you are willing to pay." "Name it," Magnus said without hesitation. "The willing sacrifice of all those who have benefited from the Pact. Not just death, but the complete erasure of their bloodline from history. Every relative, every descendant, Every person who has ever profited from Blackmoore wealth must be consumed by the ancient hunger. Phoebe felt the blood drain from her face. How many people are we talking about? Hundreds, the center figure replied. Perhaps thousands. Your employees, their families, the shareholders in your companies, the banks that hold your mortgages. The web of complicity spreads far and wide. There has to be another way, Phoebe said desperately. Some other form of payment. There is, the second figure said, its shadow form seeming to smile. A substitution of equal value. The life of one who willingly takes on the full weight of the debt, absorbing all the accumulated guilt and suffering. But such a sacrifice would mean not just death, but eternal torment. The chosen one would become a vessel for the ancient hunger, forever serving as a bridge between worlds. Magnus looked at Phoebe, and in his eyes she saw the terrible weight of 18 years of guilt and horror. I'll do it, he said quietly. I'll take on the full debt, let everyone else go free. You cannot, the third figure intoned. You are already dying, already claimed by the Pact. The substitution requires someone with years of life remaining, someone whose essence can fuel the ancient hunger for decades to come. The implication was clear. They wanted Phoebe to sacrifice herself, to become some kind of supernatural conduit for an ancient cosmic debt. The very thought made her physically ill. I need time to think, she said, backing away from the altar. This is too much to process, too much to decide in a single moment. Time is a luxury you do not possess, the center figure replied. The next payment is due at midnight, when the moon reaches its zenith. Choose now. Become the willing vessel for the ancient debt, or watch as the Pact claims its next victim. Perhaps one of your colleagues at the newspaper, or a family member who has read your letters home. Phoebe thought of her younger sister Margaret, safe in their family home in Boston, or her editor at the Tribune, who had trusted her with this assignment. The idea that her investigation might put innocent people in danger was almost unbearable. Show me, she said suddenly. Show me what happened to create this debt. If I'm going to sacrifice my life, I want to understand what I'm dying for. The shadow figures exchanged glances, their forms flickering like candle flames in a strong wind. Very well, the center figure said, but know that knowledge comes with a price. The more you learn, the deeper you become entangled in the web of the Pact. The chamber began to spin around them, the stone walls dissolving into swirling mists. Phoebe felt herself falling, not downward, but backward through time itself. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was Magnus reaching out to her, his face etched with regret and desperate hope. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the foundation chamber of Blackmoore Hall. She stood in a vast primordial forest, surrounded by trees that reached toward a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. In the distance, she could hear the sound of drums and chanting, and she knew with terrible certainty that she was about to witness the birth of the ancient debt that had consumed the Blackmoore family. The real horror was just beginning. The primordial forest stretched endlessly in all directions, its ancient trees reaching toward a sky that held 3 moons instead of 1. Phoebe stood in a clearing where the air shimmered with an otherworldly energy, and she could feel the weight of countless centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. Where are we? She whispered, though she somehow knew the shadow figures could hear her. The beginning, came the reply, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. 10,000 years ago, when the barriers between worlds were as thin as morning mist, through the trees came a procession of beings unlike anything Phoebe had ever imagined. They walked upright like humans, but their skin held the luminescence of starlight, and their eyes contained the depth of ancient wisdom. They carried objects that pulsed with inner light, crystals, metallic spheres, and geometric shapes that seemed to bend the very air around them. The Millionaire, the shadow voice explained, guardians of the cosmic balance, keepers of the artifacts that maintain the harmony between realms. They have walked this earth since before your species learned to make fire. The Millionaire moved with purposeful grace to a stone circle in the center of the clearing. The stones were massive, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. As the procession reached the circle, the beings began to arrange their artifacts in complex patterns, each placement causing the air to hum with barely contained power. The ritual of binding, the voice continued. performed every 1,000 years to renew the seals that keep the darker realms from bleeding into your world. The artifacts are not mere objects. They are living repositories of cosmic energy, each one containing the power to reshape reality itself. Phoebe watched in awe as the Luminar began their ceremony. They moved in perfect synchronization, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to make the very fabric of space vibrate. The artifacts began to glow brighter, and she could see streams of energy flowing between them, creating intricate patterns of light that extended far beyond the physical realm. But then something went wrong. The forest around the clearing began to change, the ancient trees withering and dying as if touched by some cosmic blight. The 3 moons in the sky flickered and dimmed, and from the darkness between the stars came shapes that defied description, entities of pure hunger and malevolence drawn by the power of the ritual. "The Devourers," the voice said, and for the first time, Phoebe heard fear in its tone. Ancient enemies of the Luminar, beings of pure consumption that exist only to feed on the light of creation. They had been bound in the void for eons, but the ritual's power called to them like a beacon. The Devourers fell upon the Luminar like a plague of shadows, their forms constantly shifting between solid matter and pure darkness. The Guardians fought back with weapons of crystallized light, but they were outnumbered and unprepared for such a massive assault. "The artifacts," one of the Luminar cried out, her voice carrying across the clearing. "We must protect the artifacts," but it was too late. The Devourers had already begun to corrupt the sacred objects, their touch turning the pure light into something twisted and malevolent. The stone circle cracked under the weight of the opposing forces, and reality itself began to tear like fabric. "And that is when your ancestors arrived," the voice said. Through the chaos came a group of human figures, primitive by modern standards but driven by a desperate courage. They were led by a woman with fierce eyes and hands that sparked with raw magical energy, a sorceress of considerable power who had sensed the cosmic disturbance. Morwen the Truthseeker, the voice identified her, the greatest of the ancient human mages, and the distant ancestor of the Blackmoore bloodline. She and her followers had been drawn to the battle by visions of a world consumed by darkness. Morwen raised her staff, and Phoebe could see that it was carved from some kind of crystalline material that resonated with the same energy as the Luminar artifacts. The sorceress began to weave a spell of incredible complexity, her voice cutting through the chaos as she sought to restore order to the collapsing ritual. "She could have saved them," the voice continued. "Could have helped the Luminar complete their binding and send the Devourers back to the void, but instead she chose a different path." Phoebe watched in horror as Morwen's spell changed direction. Instead of helping the Luminar, the sorceress began to draw power from the corrupted artifacts, absorbing their energy into herself and her followers. The stolen power transformed them, extending their lifespans and granting them abilities that no human should possess. "The great theft," the voice said with bitter satisfaction. "Your ancestor condemned the Luminar to extinction and doomed your world to gradual corruption, all for the sake of personal power. The artifacts were never meant for human hands. They were cosmic forces that required perfect balance to control." The scene around them began to shift and change, showing the aftermath of Morwen's actions. The Luminar, weakened by the loss of their artifacts, fell one by one to the Devourers. The ancient Guardians fought bravely to the end, but without their sacred objects they were no match for the forces of pure consumption. "The last of the Luminar died cursing your bloodline," the voice continued. "With their final breath, they bound the stolen power to a cosmic debt that would accumulate interest across the centuries. Every generation of Morwen's descendants would be marked, and eventually the debt would be called due." Phoebe found herself back in the Foundation chamber, her head spinning from the visions she had witnessed. Magnus was kneeling beside her, his face pale with concern. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked. "Hours," he replied. "The sun has set, and midnight approaches. The shadow figures have been waiting for you to return." The 3 entities stood silently around the altar, their forms more solid now, more terrible. Phoebe could see details that had been hidden before, the way their skin seemed to be made of living shadow, the way their eyes held the cold light of distant stars. "You have seen the truth," the center figure said. "Now you understand the magnitude of the debt. The power stolen by your ancestor has been passed down through generations, manifesting in different ways. Some bloodlines produced great leaders, others amassed vast fortunes. The Blackmoore wealth is simply the latest incarnation of that ancient theft. But I'm not descended from Morwen, Phoebe protested. I'm not part of the Blackmoore bloodline. Blood is not the only form of inheritance, the second figure replied. Knowledge is inheritance. Responsibility is inheritance. By learning the truth, by accepting the burden of this knowledge, you have become part of the debt. The cosmic balance recognizes no distinction between guilt by blood and guilt by choice. Magnus struggled to his feet, his movements weak but determined. There has to be another way, some form of restitution that doesn't require innocent lives. The artifacts, the third figure said slowly. If they could be recovered, if the original theft could be undone, then perhaps the debt could be forgiven. But the objects were scattered across the world, hidden in secret places, protected by guardian spells that have grown stronger over the centuries. Where are they? Phoebe asked desperately. If there's a chance to break this curse without sacrificing more lives, I have to try. The shadow figures exchanged glances, their forms flickering with what might have been uncertainty. 3 artifacts remain, the center figure said finally. The sphere of eternal seasons hidden beneath the Vatican, the crown of stellar wisdom lost in the depths of the Mariana Trench, and the heart of the cosmic flame, sealed within the Aurora Borealis itself. Those are impossible locations, Magnus said. The Vatican is guarded by the Swiss Guard and protected by centuries of Catholic mysticism. The Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the ocean, unreachable by any human technology, and the Aurora Borealis. How does one travel to the northern lights? The artifacts call to those who carry the debt, the second figure explained. They will reveal themselves to you, but only if you are willing to face the trials that guard them. Each location is protected by tests designed to break the mind and spirit of anyone who would claim the sacred objects. And if I succeed? Phoebe asked. If I somehow manage to recover all 3 artifacts, then the original theft will be undone, the third figure replied. The power will be returned to the cosmic balance, and the debt will be forgiven. But know this, the trials will likely kill you. And even if you survive, the act of handling the artifacts will transform you in ways that you cannot imagine. The chamber began to shake, dust falling from the ceiling as some tremendous force pressed down upon them. The oil lamps flickered and dimmed, and in the growing darkness, Phoebe could see more figures materializing. The spirits of the 68 people who had died to feed the Pact. The payment is due, the center figure announced. Choose now, Miss Lark. Accept the role of willing vessel and spare the innocent, or begin the quest for the artifacts and risk the lives of everyone you care about. Phoebe looked at the ghostly figures surrounding them, seeing the faces of miners, factory workers, servants and family members who had all paid the price for Magnus's ancient bargain. Among them, she recognized Eveline and Thomas Blackmoore, their spectral forms reaching out to her with desperate hope. I'll do it, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I'll find the artifacts and break this curse no matter what the cost. The shadow figures nodded slowly, their forms beginning to fade. The choice is made, the center figure said. You have until the next new moon to recover the first artifact. Fail, and the debt will be collected in full, with interest. Succeed, and you will face trials that will test the very limits of human endurance. As the entities vanished, the chamber filled with a brilliant light that seemed to come from within Phoebe herself. She could feel the weight of the cosmic debt settling upon her shoulders, but also something else, a connection to the ancient power that had started this whole nightmare. What happens now? Magnus asked, his voice weak but hopeful. Now I become something I never wanted to be, Phoebe replied, looking at her hands as they began to glow with an inner light. I become the last hope for breaking a curse that has consumed your family for 18 years. The ghosts of the 68 victims began to fade, but not before Phoebe heard their whispered words. Free us. Free us all. 3 weeks after her encounter in the Foundation Chamber, Phoebe stood in the shadows of St. Peter's Basilica, her press credentials from the Philadelphia Tribune, having secured her access to the Vatican's annual conference on historical preservation. The transformation that had begun in Blackmoore Hall continued to manifest in subtle ways. She could see auras of energy around certain objects, and ancient languages seemed to whisper their meanings directly into her mind. The sphere of eternal seasons called to her from somewhere deep beneath the Vatican. its presence tugging at her consciousness like a magnetic pull. She had spent the past weeks researching the Holy See's secret archives, following rumors of artifacts that predated Christianity by millennia. Father Giuseppe Toretti, the elderly archivist who had agreed to escort her through the restricted sections, seemed nervous as they descended into the subterranean levels beneath the apostolic palace. His hand shook as he held the ornate key that would unlock doors most Vatican scholars never knew existed. "Miss Lark," he said in heavily accented English, "I must ask again. Why does an American journalist seek access to the pre-Constantinian vaults? These chambers contain relics that predate our Lord's birth by thousands of years." "Historical research, Father," Phoebe replied, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue. "I'm writing about the Church's preservation of pagan artifacts for academic study." Father Toretti stopped at a massive bronze door inscribed with symbols that made Phoebe's newly awakened senses recoil. The priest's weathered fingers traced the ancient markings with obvious reverence. "These symbols," he murmured, "they speak of powers that existed before the foundation of the world. The Church has guarded them for centuries, not out of worship, but out of necessity. Some knowledge is too dangerous for mortal minds." As the door swung open, Phoebe felt the full force of the sphere's presence wash over her. The artifact was close, perhaps 50 feet below their current position. But between her and her goal lay something that made her blood run cold. The chamber beyond the bronze door was filled with the remains of previous seekers. Dozens of skeletons lay scattered across the marble floor, their bones bleached white by centuries of exposure. Each skeleton clutched some form of weapon or tool, suggesting they had died fighting rather than fleeing. But it was the expressions frozen on their preserved skulls that truly horrified Phoebe. Mouths open in silent screams, eye sockets wide with terror. "Madonna mia," Father Toretti whispered, crossing himself rapidly. "I was told these chambers were empty. Who were these people?" "Thieves," Phoebe said, though she wasn't sure how she knew. The knowledge seemed to flow directly from the cosmic debt now bound to her soul. "They came seeking the same thing I seek, but they were consumed by the trial." At the center of the chamber stood a spiral staircase carved from black obsidian, descending into depths that seemed to swallow light itself. Ancient Greek text was etched into the walls, and Phoebe found she could read it as easily as English. "Here lies the gateway to the realm of eternal seasons. Let none pass who cannot answer the riddle of time itself. Death awaits the proud, madness the foolish, and transformation the worthy." "We should leave," Father Toretti said, his voice barely a whisper. "This place, it is not meant for human souls." But Phoebe was already descending the obsidian staircase, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. The priest's footsteps echoed behind her as he reluctantly followed, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the earth than should have been possible beneath Vatican City. The air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the weight of ancient power. Strange lights began to flicker in the walls themselves, not torch flames or electric bulbs, but something that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a cosmic heartbeat. "Miss Lark," Father Toretti called from above, his voice already distant. "I can go no further. The weight, it is crushing my spirit." Phoebe looked back to see the priest collapsed on the stairs, his face pale and drawn. The cosmic energy in this place was affecting him differently than it affected her. Where she felt strengthened and connected, he was being slowly drained of life force. "Go back, Father," she called to him. "Tell no one what you've seen here." She continued her descent alone, and as she did, the walls around her began to change. The rough stone gave way to smooth crystal surfaces that reflected not her image, but visions of other times and places. She saw herself as a child in Boston, playing in her family's garden. She saw her sister Margaret, now a young woman preparing for marriage. She saw her colleagues at the Tribune, going about their daily work, unaware that their friend was descending into a realm that existed outside normal reality. But then, the visions turned darker. She saw Margaret collapsing at her wedding altar, blood streaming from her eyes. She saw her editor at the Tribune hanging from the ceiling of his office, his face twisted in agony. She saw her parents, aged beyond recognition, dying alone in a house that had become a monument to grief. "The price of failure," a voice whispered from the walls themselves. "Everyone you love will pay for your inadequacy." Phoebe forced herself to keep walking, to ignore the horrific visions that surrounded her. She knew they were designed to break her spirit, to turn her back before she could reach the sphere. But the image of the 68 ghosts in Blackmoore Hall drove her forward. They had died for Magnus's greed, and she would not let their sacrifice be meaningless. Finally, after what felt like hours of descent, she emerged into a vast underground cavern that defied all logic. The space was impossibly large, its ceiling lost in darkness above. But it was not empty darkness. Phoebe could see stars twinkling in the void overhead, constellations that belonged to no earthly sky. In the center of the cavern stood a temple unlike anything she had ever imagined. Its architecture seemed to shift and change as she watched, sometimes appearing Greek, sometimes Egyptian, sometimes belonging to no human civilization at all. The building seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its true form too complex for her mind to fully process. "Welcome, daughter of the ancient debt," a voice spoke from the temple's entrance. "You seek the sphere of eternal seasons, but first, you must prove yourself worthy of such power." From the shadows of the temple emerged a figure that made Phoebe's enhanced senses recoil in terror. It was humanoid in basic shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in directions that violated the laws of anatomy. Its face was a smooth oval of silver metal, unmarked by any features save for 2 holes where eyes should be. "I am the guardian of the first trial," the entity said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "I have waited here for 10,000 years, watching over the sphere, testing those who would claim it. Most fail before they even reach this place. Those who do make it this far usually die within the first hour." "What is the trial?" Phoebe asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Time," the guardian replied. "The sphere of eternal seasons controls the flow of time itself within a limited area. To claim it, you must experience every moment of the cosmic debt, every death, every betrayal, every act of greed that has led to this moment. You will live through the suffering of the 68 victims, feel their pain as if it were your own, know their despair as they realized they were dying for another's profit." The guardian gestured toward the temple, and the massive doors swung open to reveal a chamber filled with swirling temporal energy. At the center of the maelstrom sat a sphere of crystalline material that seemed to contain entire seasons within its depths. She could see spring rain falling, summer lightning crackling, autumn leaves turning, and winter snow swirling in an endless cycle. "But that is not all," the guardian continued. "You will also experience the guilt of Magnus Blackmoore, the desperation that drove him to make his bargain. You will feel the ancient hunger of the devourers, the cosmic rage of the shadow figures, the sorrow of the luminar as they died. Every emotion, every moment of pain that has contributed to this debt will become part of you." "And if I survive this trial?" Phoebe asked. "Then you will understand the true weight of what you seek to undo," the guardian replied. "And you will face a choice that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of reality itself." Phoebe looked at the swirling temporal vortex, knowing that entering it would likely drive her insane or kill her outright. But she also knew that turning back would doom everyone she loved to become victims of the ancient debt. She stepped into the temple. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, reality exploded around her. She was no longer Phoebe Lark, investigative journalist from Philadelphia. She was Magnus Blackmoore, standing in a mine shaft in 1870, listening to voices that promised him everything he had ever wanted. She felt his desperation, his hunger for something more than a life of backbreaking labor and poverty. But then she was Eveline Blackmoore, drowning in the black water of the garden fountain, understanding in her final moments that her husband's success had come at a terrible price. She felt the water filling her lungs, felt the cold embrace of death claiming her even as Magnus's wealth multiplied. The visions came faster now, each one more horrific than the last. She was Thomas Blackmoore, bleeding out on his 21st birthday, watching his life force drain away to fuel his father's empire. She was each of the 27 miners who died in the explosion, feeling their terror as the tunnel collapsed around them. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional anguish. She felt Magnus's guilt growing with each death, his desperate attempts to convince himself that the price was worth paying. She experienced his slow descent into madness as he realized that the Pact would never release its hold on his family. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had no meaning in the temple. Phoebe lived through every moment of suffering that had fed the cosmic debt, and with each experience she felt a piece of her sanity slip away. How could she continue knowing that she carried the weight of so much pain and death? But then, just as she thought she could endure no more, the visions changed. She began to see the other side of the story, the love between Magnus and Eveline before the Pact corrupted their marriage. The pride Thomas felt in his father's accomplishments before he learned the truth. The hope of the miners' families when Magnus's success brought prosperity to their community. She saw the Luminar in their prime, guardians of cosmic balance who had dedicated their existence to protecting all life in the universe. She felt their desperate courage as they fought the Devourers, knowing that defeat would mean the slow consumption of everything they held dear. And finally, she experienced something unexpected: forgiveness. The ghostly voices of the 68 victims spoke to her across the temporal vortex, their anger replaced by a weary understanding. They had paid the price for Magnus's bargain, but they also recognized that he had become as much a victim of the Pact as they were. "End it," they whispered. "Break the chain of suffering. Free us all." The temporal storm began to subside, and Phoebe found herself standing before the sphere of eternal seasons. The artifact was beautiful beyond description, its crystalline surface containing miniature worlds where the seasons played out in perfect harmony. But she could also feel the immense power contained within it, power enough to reshape reality itself. "You have survived the trial of time," the Guardian said, its metallic face somehow conveying approval. "You have experienced the full weight of the cosmic debt and emerged with your sanity intact. That is more than any seeker has accomplished in over 1,000 years." Phoebe reached out toward the sphere, her hand trembling with anticipation and fear. "What happens when I touch it?" "You will be transformed," the Guardian replied. "The sphere will bind itself to your essence, granting you power over temporal forces within a limited area. But such power comes with responsibility. You will become a guardian yourself, tasked with protecting the cosmic balance that your ancestors' theft disrupted." As her fingers made contact with the crystal surface, Phoebe felt a surge of energy unlike anything she had ever experienced. The sphere dissolved into pure light, flowing into her body and merging with her very soul. She could feel time itself bending around her, responding to her will like a living thing. But with the power came knowledge, terrible, overwhelming knowledge of what she would face in the trials ahead. The crown of stellar wisdom in the depths of the Mariana Trench, guarded secrets that could drive entire civilizations mad. The heart of the cosmic flame in the Aurora Borealis was protected by entities that made the shadow figures seem like benevolent spirits. "The first trial is complete," the Guardian said as the temple began to fade around them. "But your journey has only begun. The debt still accumulates, and with each passing day, the price of failure grows higher." Phoebe found herself back in the Vatican chamber, surrounded by the skeletons of failed seekers. But she was no longer entirely human. She could see the flow of time around her like visible streams, could sense the approaching moment when the cosmic debt would claim its next victims if she failed to recover the remaining artifacts. Above her, she could hear Father Toretti calling her name, his voice echoing down the obsidian staircase. She began her ascent back to the surface, carrying within her the power of eternal seasons and the weight of cosmic responsibility. 2 artifacts remained, and time was running out. The research vessel Erebus cut through the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean, its reinforced hull groaning against the shifting ice floes. Phoebe stood at the bow, her enhanced senses tracking the ethereal pull of the heart of the cosmic flame, somewhere in the dancing lights above. 3 months had passed since she'd recovered the crown of stellar wisdom from the Mariana Trench, a trial that had cost her 2 fingers to frostbite from the deep-sea pressure suit failure, but had granted her the ability to perceive the underlying mathematical structure of reality itself. Now, with the Aurora Borealis blazing across the star-filled sky in sheets of green and gold, she prepared for the final trial. Captain Eric Nordahl, the grizzled Norwegian who commanded the vessel, approached her with obvious concern. "Miss Lark, the instruments are going mad. The compass spins like a child's top, and the radio receives signals from stations that don't exist. Are you certain we should continue north?" Phoebe nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her heart. The power of the first 2 artifacts had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She could manipulate time in small bursts and see the cosmic mathematics that governed reality. But each use of these abilities drained something essential from her humanity. She caught glimpses of herself in mirrors and saw eyes that held too much knowledge, features that were subtly wrong, as if she were slowly becoming something other than human. "The heart calls to me," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "It's directly above us, embedded in the aurora itself." "That's impossible," Nordahl protested. "The northern lights are electromagnetic phenomena, charged particles interacting with our atmosphere. They're not solid matter. Nothing about this journey follows normal rules, Captain," Phoebe replied. She raised her hand, and the air around it shimmered with temporal distortions. "I need you to position the ship directly under the brightest concentration of lights. And Captain, you might want to secure anything that isn't bolted down." As the Erebus moved into position, the aurora above them began to pulse with unnatural intensity. The lights descended lower than they should have been physically possible, reaching down toward the ship like luminous fingers. Phoebe could feel the heart of the cosmic flame responding to her presence, its power resonating with the artifacts already bound to her soul. But she was not alone in the Arctic waters. "Captain," the radio operator called from the bridge, "I'm receiving a transmission, but it's not from any earthly source." The voice that emerged from the speakers was the same one that had haunted Phoebe since her first encounter in Blackmoore Hall. The shadow figures, their tone carrying a mixture of approval and warning. "The final trial approaches, heir to the ancient debt. But know this, the heart of the cosmic flame is not merely protected by guardians. It is a guardian, the last fragment of the original cosmic balance that existed before the theft. To claim it is to risk not just your life, but the stability of reality itself." "I understand the risks," Phoebe replied, speaking to the radio as if it were a person. "But the debt must be paid. 68 innocent souls deserve justice." "Justice," the voice repeated, and there was something like laughter in its tone. "You still believe this is about justice? Look up, child of two worlds. See what your quest has truly accomplished." Phoebe raised her eyes to the aurora and gasped in horror at what she saw. The lights were no longer the beautiful natural phenomenon she remembered from her childhood books. Instead, they had become a vast battlefield where forces beyond human comprehension waged war across the sky. Entities of pure light clashed with creatures of living shadow, their conflict sending ripples through the fabric of space-time itself. She could see tears in reality where the battle had grown too intense, glimpses of other dimensions bleeding through into the Earth's atmosphere. "The Devourers," she whispered, recognizing some of the shadow creatures from her visions. "They've found the heart. They have always known where it was," the radio voice corrected. "The heart of the cosmic flame is the last seal holding them in the void between worlds. Your quest to recover the artifacts has weakened that seal with each trial you've completed. The power you've absorbed was meant to remain separate, scattered across impossible distances. By bringing it together, you have created a beacon that calls to every force of destruction in the universe." The ship began to rock violently as the battle above intensified. Captain Nordahl fought to maintain control as waves that defied natural law crashed over the deck. Waves made of solid light and liquid darkness, carrying fragments of alien mathematics that turned water into something that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "Then I've made everything worse," Phoebe said, despair creeping into her voice. "The cosmic debt will never be paid. More innocent people will die because of my actions." "Not necessarily," the voice replied. "There is one final option, but it requires a sacrifice beyond anything you have yet contemplated. The heart of the cosmic flame can be claimed, but only by one who willingly becomes the new guardian of the balance. Such a choice would bind you to the aurora forever, transforming you into an entity of pure energy tasked with maintaining the seal between worlds. And the debt would be transferred to the cosmic balance itself, paid by the universe rather than by human lives. But you would cease to exist as Phoebe Lark. Your consciousness would expand to encompass the protection of all realities, all possibilities, all potential futures. You would become less than human and more than mortal." Above them, the battle reached a crescendo. A creature of pure devourer essence broke through the lines of light guardians and dove toward the ship, its form a writhing mass of hunger and malevolence that seemed to absorb the very concept of existence around it. Phoebe felt the power of the two artifacts surge within her. The sphere of eternal seasons slowed time around the ship, while the crown of stellar wisdom revealed the mathematical weak points in the creature's structure. But even with cosmic power at her disposal, she knew she was no match for something that existed to consume reality itself. "The choice must be made now," the voice urged. "Claim the heart and become the guardian, or watch as the seal fails and the devourers pour into your dimension like a cosmic plague." "What about Magnus?" Phoebe asked desperately. "What about the 68 souls trapped by the Pact?" "They will be freed," the voice promised. "The cosmic balance recognizes the difference between willing sacrifice and forced servitude. Your choice to become the guardian would retroactively absolve all previous debts, releasing every soul that has been claimed by the ancient hunger." The devourer reached the ship, its touch turning the steel deck into something that existed in negative space. Captain Nordahl and his crew began to scream as their bodies were slowly erased from reality, starting with their extremities and working inward. Phoebe made her choice. She launched herself into the air, drawing on every scrap of power the artifacts had granted her. Time dilated around her as she rose toward the aurora, the mathematical structure of reality revealing itself in blazing clarity. She could see the heart of the cosmic flame now, a sphere of pure creation energy embedded in the center of the light display, pulsing with the rhythm of universal birth and death. The moment her hand touched the heart, the universe exploded around her. Every thought she had ever had, every memory, every hope and fear and dream, expanded to encompass galaxies. She felt her individual consciousness dissolving, becoming one with the cosmic forces that maintained the balance between creation and destruction. The artifacts that had been bound to her soul merged completely with her essence, transforming her into something that existed on multiple planes of reality simultaneously. She was Phoebe Lark, investigative journalist from Philadelphia. She was the guardian of the Aurora, protector of the cosmic seal. She was the mathematical equation that governed the interaction between dimensions. She was the story that reality told itself about the nature of justice and sacrifice. Below her, the battle ceased as the devourers found themselves faced with a guardian whose power dwarfed anything they had encountered before. The tears in reality sealed themselves, the chaotic energies dissipated, and the aurora returned to its natural beauty, though now it pulsed with consciousness, with purpose, with the eternal vigilance of one who had chosen cosmic responsibility over personal existence. On the ship below, Captain Nordahl and his crew found themselves whole again, their bodies restored by the Guardian's power. They would remember this night for the rest of their lives, but they would never be able to fully explain what they had witnessed. And in Blackmoore Hall, thousands of miles away, Magnus Blackmoore felt the weight of 18 years lift from his shoulders as 68 ghostly figures materialized in his library one final time. They were no longer angry, no longer bound by cosmic debt. They smiled at him with forgiveness and understanding before fading into the peace they had been denied for so long. "It is finished," they whispered as they departed. "The debt is paid." Magnus would live for 3 more years, using his wealth to build hospitals and schools, to fund research into industrial safety, to ensure that no other families would suffer as his had. When he died, it was peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the photographs of workers whose lives had been improved by his late-in-life philanthropy. The Blackmoore fortune was donated in its entirety to charitable causes. The cursed mansion turned into a home for orphaned children. The foundation chamber was sealed forever, its dark history buried beneath tons of concrete and blessed earth. But in the Arctic sky, the aurora borealis dances still, more beautiful than ever before, and sometimes on the clearest nights, observers with sensitive instruments report that the lights seem to pulse in patterns that almost resemble Morse code. Remember the cost of greed. Remember the price of justice. Remember that some sacrifices echo across eternity. The cosmic debt has been paid in full, but the Guardian watches still, ensuring that the balance between worlds remains stable, that the devourers stay trapped in the void where they belong. Phoebe Lark gave up her humanity to save the universe, and in doing so, became something far greater than human. A living reminder that true justice sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. In the depths of the Mariana Trench, strange lights occasionally pulse in tribute to their guardian sister. In the vaults beneath the Vatican, Father Toretti sometimes hears whispers of gratitude in languages that predate human speech. And in small towns across America, people report dreams of a woman made of starlight who watches over them while they sleep, protecting them from nightmares that exist in the spaces between realities. The Blackmoore legacy of blood and horror has ended, but the legacy of Phoebe Lark, guardian of the balance, protector of the cosmic seal, will endure until the last star burns out and reality itself comes to an end. Some prices can only be paid once. Some debts can only be settled by those brave enough to sacrifice everything for the sake of others. And some stories can only end when someone chooses to become part of something larger than themselves, even if it means ceasing to exist as they once were. The aurora borealis continues to dance, and in its lights those who know how to look can sometimes see the face of a woman who loved humanity enough to save it from a debt 10,000 years in the making.